Good evening, all, and thank you for tuning in to tonight's story. If you enjoy it, please remember to subscribe and like the video so we can continue bringing you more horror stories. Now, without further ado, take a deep breath and relax as we take a journey through the night. The house sat alone at the end of Briarwood Lane, forgotten by time, swallowed by ivy and shadows. Its windows were dead eyes gazing blankly into the night. The air smelled of damp earth and musk. Detective Eliza Marrow hesitated at the threshold. The front door had been left ajar, revealing only a sliver of darkness beyond. She pulled her coat tighter against the autumn chill, forcing herself to step inside. The floor groaned beneath her weight. Dust danced in the slivers of moonlight, slicing through the broken windows. The silence was too thick, pressing against her ears like hands over her face. The call had come in an hour ago. A missing persons case led here. A neighbor reported a strange smell seeping through the walls like the house itself was exhaling something foul. Eliza stepped forward, her gloved fingers brushing against the peeling wallpaper. The house exuded a palpable unease, a sensation that coiled in her gut like an off-key melody, recognizable yet disturbingly distorted. Then the dining room came into view. She stopped breathing. A long table stretched nearly the length of the room, covered in an elegant red tablecloth, its deep color soaking up the flickering candlelight. Silver plates gleamed under the warm glow, each set meticulously, as if for a grand banquet. But it wasn't the table setting that made bile rise in her throat. It was the guests. A dozen figures sat in high-backed chairs, perfectly posed. Their hands were clasped together, fingers interlaced as if in quiet prayer. Their heads were tilted slightly downward, expressions locked in eerie serenity. But their skin, it was wax, thick, pale, dripping down their faces in frozen rivers, their eyes hidden beneath layers of hardened candle wax. Their throats were sealed, their bodies hollowed. Where their stomachs should have been, there was only emptiness, filled with melted wax. Eliza's stomach churned violently. The stench of burning fat clung to the air, thick and nauseating. It was as if the victims had been transformed into human candelabras. Their own bodies used to light the feast. Her breath came in shallow gasps. She forced herself to move closer, remembering to cling to her training in times such as these. Each wax-coated corpse was dressed in their finest. Suits and dresses, silk and velvet, stained with melted remains. Their hands were positioned just so, their posture perfectly maintained, their faces forever locked in silent approval of the horrors around them. The vomit in her throat burned, but she swallowed it down. Her trembling fingers reached for the nearest victim, the woman in the emerald dress. She touched the hardened wax at the corner of her lips. The texture was smooth, solid, until she pressed slightly. The lips cracked. A wet sound followed as the wax splintered, revealing the horror beneath. The woman's mouth wasn't empty. It was stuffed full of something unrecognizable at first. Something dark, twisted, folded upon itself. Then realization struck. Meat. Chunks of raw meat were wedged into her mouth and fused together by the wax. The candlelight flickered over the exposed horror, revealing strands of hair tangled within. Human hair. The feast wasn't just for show, it had been real. A sound broke the silence, a slow, deliberate clap. Eliza spun, drawing her weapon, her breath coming in frantic bursts. The shadows at the far end of the dining room shifted, and from them, a figure emerged. A man dressed in an old-fashioned suit stepped forward, the candlelight playing tricks on the edges of his face. His features were sharp and clear, like porcelain. His eyes gleamed with amusement. His lips curled into a knowing smile. "Detective Marrow," he purred, his voice rich and silken. "How wonderful of you to join us." Eliza's grip tightened around her gun. "Hands where I can see them." The man exhaled a soft chuckle, raising his hands lazily. "Oh, detective, there's no need for that. You're interrupting a most sacred ritual." Eliza's stomach twisted. "You did this." His name was William Murray. Eliza remembered interviewing him shortly after people started going missing, but he had a solid alibi, or so she thought. She had him in her hands but let him go. Could his victims have survived if she dug deeper into his alibi? Maybe. William tilted his head, as if considering. "Did?" He let the word linger before shaking his head. "No, my dear. I created." Her pulse roared in her ears. "Why?" William sighed, stepping closer. The candlelight made his presence feel heavier, casting his shadow long across the wax-stiffened corpses. "The feast must always continue," he murmured. "The silent ones are eternal. They watch, they listen, and in return, they are granted their place at the table." Eliza's hand shook, her mind screaming at her to pull the trigger. But something held her in place, a deep instinctual terror, a feeling that to move, to act, would be to break some unspoken rule of the room. "Their mouths filled with flesh," she choked out. His smile widened. "A feast requires an offering, detective." She wanted to run. Every cell in her body begged her to flee. But the man took another step forward, and she realized the wax on his face was melting, dripping slowly, revealing something black, a masquerade mask beneath. "Will you sit?" he asked, his voice lilting like a lover's whisper. "Or will you be served?" Eliza's breath hitched, her grip on the gun tightening. "Don't move or I will shoot," she warned. The figures at the table seemed to shift, just slightly, their heads twitching toward her, as if they had been waiting for her decision, as if they were listening. William ignored her warning and bolted towards her. Then she fired. The gunshot shattered the silence, echoing through the house like a thunderclap. William's expression flickered in surprise before the bullet tore through his forehead. The back of his skull exploded in a shower of wax and raw, wet tissue. He staggered, his knees buckling, and collapsed onto the table, sending silverware clattering to the floor. The candle flames trembled. The air grew still. The figures at the table remained motionless, their waxen faces frozen in eternal expressions. Eliza swallowed hard, her breath coming in ragged gasps. She kept the gun raised, her finger twitching on the trigger, but there was no movement, no whispering, no laughter. The feast was over. Turning on her heel, she rushed from the house, her footsteps pounding against the rotting wood. The night air hit her like a slap, the cold slicing through her sweat-soaked clothes. She didn't stop running until she reached her car, hands fumbling for the radio. "This is Detective Marrow," she gasped. "Briarwood Lane. I need backup. Now." As the sirens wailed in the distance, she allowed herself one last look at the house. The windows remained dark, the front door yawning open like a mouth. The feast had ended, and she had no intention of ever letting it begin again.